Hello, good evening. Hello, everyone, thank you. On behalf of Lamont-Doherty, I'd like to welcome you to tonight's conversation, which is entitled, All Rings Considered, The Life of a Tree Ring Scientist. So my name's Dave Goldberg, I'm the Deputy Director at Lamont, and also Paris Lamont Research Professor for Carbon Management. And I'd like to first welcome you all, thanks for coming out, and to say that Lamont is very proud to host these public lecture series, bringing together the community and our network of supporters to hear from many of our distinguished scientists at Lamont. The series not only highlights the groundbreaking work that these researchers have done, but also emphasizes the broader importance of earth science and research in general. We hope the lectures foster some deep understanding amongst you all and allow us both to engage and discuss the impacts of global environmental change with our local communities, with you, of course, and encouraging action and some informed decisions. So tonight, we'll hear from Brendan Buckley. He's a Lamont Research Professor and longtime member of the Tree Ring Laboratory at Lamont. Brendan has worked around the globe, and he is best known as a pioneer of tropical dendroclimatology, which is a science which has produced the longest and most well-replicated records of absolutely dated tree ring sequences, mostly in Southeast Asia. So among his most important discoveries are the identification of two key periods of drought that have coincided with the most tumultuous periods of the past millennium in Southeast Asia. He's also had a long history of research and studies in North America, having conducted some of the first dendroclimatic studies in northern Labrador, Canada, and worked on North America's northernmost trees in the Firth River in Alaska. He was also instrumental in developing the longest temperature reconstructions from the southern hemisphere, so he's bipolar. Sorry, Brett. Coincided with the two most tumultuous, sorry, I read the wrong thing. The Southern Hemisphere work was part of his PhD research in Tasmania and New Zealand. So this lecture promises to be a fascinating look at some of the crucial work of the Tree Ring Laboratory at Lamont over the past 50 years, and as well as an exploration of the impactful work and research that Brendan has conducted himself. So on a personal note, Brendan and I have been at Lamont for a long time, both, and I've had the pleasure of working with him more closely in the last couple of years, looking at the instrumentation of the Lamont Sanctuary Forest, which you came through on the way over to the auditorium today, and also in teaching together in a sustainability science program, a graduate science educational program, which Brendan now directs. So I can say from this recent experience especially, but also from obviously his long record and history of research here at Lamont, that without a doubt you are in for a inspiring lecture tonight, and you are going to be treated to that in a moment. I will also say that there is time at the end for questions, and please hold your comments and thoughts till that point when Brendan's finished. And that's it from me. I'd like to welcome Brendan to the podium.
Sorry. Now you built me up too much. It's like I'm gonna have to perform here. I also love the fact that there's alcohol at these things. It's a really good idea. People should always drink before they come to a talk. It's a really wonderful idea. Maybe I should not drink so much before I talk, but it's always a good thing. I'm giving a fairly introspective talk tonight, and I hope I'm as inspiring as Dave just said I was going to be. So if I fall flat, well, that's real unfortunate. But I'm really, it's one of these times of your life, you know, when you come across the 75th anniversary of Lamont, which is really quite a remarkable thing. This is an institute, my entire working career has been here. And it's the 50th anniversary of the Tree Ring Lab later this year in September, which you'll hear about in a little while. And I also recently had my 67th birthday in Vietnam a month ago with all of my colleagues that I've worked with. They're actually more like family now for the last 20 years. So as you get to this point, and there's all these milestones that you start reading about, the R word creeps in. I'm talking about retribution. I've made a lot of enemies over the last few years. Looking at you, Cook. But no, really, you know, the idea of retirement and thinking on, you're reflecting on the life that you've lived in this working career. And so I've selected as my opening picture here, one of my favorite pictures. I think the guy's name was Graham Johnson. It was a photographer that Columbia hired to work with Ed and me in Tasmania. And that's me when I had hair and Ed on the top of Mount Reed, overlooking this vast expanse of rainforest in Tasmania, which is, I put this up there and I chose this because I feel like life has these moments of magic that you come across once in a while. It can be a week or a month or longer sometimes, and it's always when the stars align so that the people you're working with or your best friend that you meet at camp or whatever it happens to be, grad school is one of these such things. Probably one of the most magical times of my life, certainly of my career, was here in Tasmania. And I'll tell you a little bit about that as we go through. Now let's hope I don't hit the wrong buttons on here. So in September, as I noted, the Tree Ring Lab is going to have its 50th anniversary. And the Tree Ring Lab has an interesting history, and it's these three gentlemen that you see at the bottom here. Wally Broker, who many of you knew and certainly know of. Wally was a legendary geoscientist here at Lamont for many years, passed away a couple years ago. But his idea was to have a lab where tree rings were being used to look as paleothermometers to add to the abundant other proxies that were being used here. And there's a long story here. I won't go into too much detail of it, but Gordon Jacoby had done his PhD, and Wally knew him. He did his PhD here at Columbia. And he had worked on a project that used tree rings to reconstruct stream flow on the Colorado River, which was a really landmark work. He and Chuck Stockton did that work. And so Wally conscripted Gordon to come back because he was a Columbia grad and he knew him. And of course, then the main thing was to get a proper tree ring scientist who had actually worked in Tucson. Ed Cook's name was brought up, as that you had to hire Ed Cook to come back here. Ed was from the East Coast, and so as Ed likes to describe this, it was a marriage made not exactly in heaven. Is this too much feedback? Okay. Not exactly in heaven, but in a much hotter climate. These were big personalities that came together to work together, and not just Wally, but Gordon and Ed also. So there was a lot of science in Lamont was kind of a bare-knuckled affair back in those days. And I think there was a lot of good back and forth. It was healthy scientific debate. And all three of these were major personalities that worked together. But what happened was they managed to produce probably the most significant tree ring work that's ever been produced in any lab, and created the preeminent lab here at Lamont. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the things that were here. Gordon Jacoby, he passed away in 2014, unfortunately. But Gordon was, as I mentioned, he was on the first streamflow reconstruction of the Colorado River with Chuck Stockton. And the importance of that was interesting because it turns out that the water that was allocated in the Colorado River Pact was from the wettest 30-year period of the last 700 plus years, maybe the last 1,000 years. And so they were allocating way more water to the interest than was available in the river. And the reason we knew this was once we looked at the paleo record, you could see that it was clearly a pluvial that was the 30 years of measured data. And it had been way drier since that, so they had over-allocated water. The other thing Gordon was instrumental in was following up on work done by someone named Giddings. And when I first arrived at the Tree Ring Lab, he was really one of the first people to do these major forays into the boreal forests of the subarctic. So all over Canada and Alaska. He worked in many different places, Siberia, Mongolia. He also pioneered dendroseismology studies, where it used trees to look at earthquake events in the past, and identified some periods of earthquake movement on the San Andreas Fault that were prehistoric and hadn't been known prior in Wrightwood Canyon in Southern California. And then when he hired me, we were working on the northern part of the San Andreas Fault in Northern California. He also was when I first met Gordon, was starting to work on early tropical forays of tree rings, and I'll get to that in a little while. Now, Ed, who's sitting right here in the front, I kid him that he's my arch enemy. Ed and I are like brothers, so we sometimes hate each other and sometimes love each other. That's the way it goes. But Ed, when he came here, was working on eastern temperate forests. And it was one of these things where, working from the Tucson lab, where people were mainly dealing with trees that grew in the American West, they were very obviously and easily seen how they related to climate, because the overprint of climate was so strong and so uniform across space in the Southwest. When you got to the eastern forest, you had all this competition for multiple species in a closed canopy forest, and many people thought that was going to be something that was not really going to work out very well. Ed was the one who developed the methodology to allow this to happen. So the first drought reconstructions of eastern United States were done by Ed in his early days here in the tree ring lab. He also was one of the pioneers of the work in the southern hemisphere, which is how I got involved in Tasmania. And during the course of that work, we developed some 4,000 plus years of temperature reconstruction from Tasmania and New Zealand. And these are really super important records, very long and very keyed into temperature in the southern hemisphere. But what Ed is probably best known for are the drought atlases, the methodology that he has developed to make atlases of the hydroclimate across broad space and time by using the tree ring records in a way that was very unique. And these are, you're going to hear more about these toward the end of the talk, but these products are incredibly useful, and they've been published on many, many times, and everybody uses them in a variety of fields. And I would argue that they're the most significant product to come out of dendrochronology really ever. I don't know, someone might disagree with that. But then the third person here, the third pillar of the tree ring lab, was Roseanne Dorigo, and she was the first doctorate student to go through the tree ring lab. And this is back in the day when it wasn't the Lamont-Doherty Earth Observatory, it was the Geological Observatory, LDGO, and it really was a hard rock geology place. And Roseanne, coming through here with a background in botany and plant sciences, had to take all those hard rock geology classes. So it was a hard road to go through for her. But she came through it really well, and she was one of the mentors that I was lucky enough to have when I got here. Between the three of Gordon and Ed and Roseanne, I learned from three of the best on how to raise money and grant funding and write good papers and be part of this amazing thing here to make it work at a place like Lamont. So I owe a great debt of gratitude to all three of them. Roseanne was working with Gordon on the Northern Hemisphere temperature tree ring reconstructions, and also was one of the first people to look closely at the volcanic signals in tree rings by using maximum density to see how the rings would either be dense or less dense with these cold events that related to dust veil events from volcanoes. And one of the other things that she pioneered was looking at these early studies of the divergence problem where tree rings, the growth of rings radially were starting to decouple from temperature in the northern tree line. It was related to the nonlinearities in the relationship between growth and temperature. And she was one of the first people to publish on those in some great detail. And then, more importantly for me, Roseanne was another one of the persons that got involved in these forays into the Asian tropics in Indonesia, looking at teaks as a follow-up to a really interesting paper by a Dutch scientist named Berlage that produced a record from Java in the 1930s that had a really strong linkage between teak growth and rainfall. And what I think makes that study so interesting was when I first came into this field, the general thinking was that you weren't going to be able to work in the tropics for a variety of reasons. Mainly, the climate wasn't defined enough to allow the trees to form a shutdown period that gave you the ability to see a growth ring. And so there would be way too much competition between tree species. And in actuality, a lot of that's true. But in some instances, it does work, and you're able to, if you're in the right circumstances, as you'll see as you go through this talk, to get good records of tree growth that are linked to climate in Southeast Asia in these tropical regions. And that was what Roseanne and Gordon were doing. And so they had the data from the Berlage record, but they didn't have the wood from it. So the tree ring measurements were there, and they were able to actually do a reconstruction by going back to Indonesia and collecting new samples and working on that. And I actually will talk a little bit about my own experiences with that. Now, the very inner-looking part of this record, of this talk for me was when I started thinking about how it was that I came about to be a dendrochronologist. And someone earlier tonight asked me what the story was of that, and my short answer is that it was by accident. I don't think I ever even thought about this before when I was a young man coming up through the rank. So I'm going to tell a little bit of my personal story, mainly because it's not because I'm looking for sympathy, although pity is very underrated, I will admit that. But I have kind of an interesting way that I came about being in this field. This is a picture of me in 1976 on the John Muir Trail. I was 18 years old at the time. In 1975, when the tree ring lab was being developed, I was on the Appalachian Trail between my junior and senior years of high school. And our family home had just been repossessed, and I was homeless and was developing a little bit of a drug problem. And so I decided the thing to do would be to get on the Appalachian Trail and kind of straighten myself up. Little did I know that on the Appalachian Trail there'd be more drugs than I ever saw in my hometown. But I managed to get away from that very well by the time. So I just developed this knack or this tendency to go into wild places, into the forest. And it was just because it gave me solace and it was something that made life bearable to me. I was very fortunate to meet this man, William Simpson, who I met on the Appalachian Trail in 1975 in Pinkham Notch as he came off Mount Washington in the middle of a snowstorm. And it's hard to tell from this picture, but Willie's like 5'2". But he was probably the toughest human being I've ever known. In 1968 in Vietnam, he was blown up and left for dead in the rice paddies, pretty close to where I ended up working several decades later and have developed tree ring records from there. And we exchanged addresses, and the next year I ended up I should mention that when I finished the Appalachian Trail, I finished up in Maine late for high school. So I had to hitchhike back to my hometown, and I showed up about a week late for high school. And this is a pattern that would persist when I went to college in 76 and 77, because I hiked the John Muir Trail with Willie, and then when I got back, I hitchhiked from Duluth, Minnesota back, and I was late coming back. So I don't know if any of you, or some of you are old enough to remember what registration was like back in the 70s for college. You physically went to a desk with someone there. So you can imagine my transcript is filled with classes in philosophy and history and things that I wasn't necessarily planning on taking, but turned out to be some pretty interesting classes. In 1977, I hitchhiked to Memphis, met Willie. We went out to the Johns Mountain Range in Alaska where Ketchikan is, and we did a trailless hike across the mountains and finished this thing. And I hitchhiked back from, at that point it was Winnipeg, to get back home, and again, I was late for college. In 1978 was the last trip that I did with Willie. We canoed the Yukon River. I hitchhiked out to Banff, Alberta, and met him. At this point, I dropped out of college, and I wasn't really doing that well, and I thought I would pursue my wilderness habits. So I went out and joined Willie, canoed the Yukon River, and then I worked in fish canneries in Alaska and made myself partway around the world before I ran out of money and had to come and deal with that. And so I ended up back in New Hampshire again. And by this point, I decided, for some stupid reason, that I needed to get more wilderness experience. So in 1980, my brother Chris and I did a traverse of the Torngat Mountains in Labrador, which is a really remote section of Labrador, and put ourselves in the craziest circumstances you could imagine. We got dropped off by float plane and had to hike 45 days through the mountains to get picked up by a boat. With the guy that we made the arrangement to pick us up with, it was on the dock in Nain, Labrador, as we were leaving in the plane. And it turns out we weren't quite sure where he was going to pick us up or whether there was even it was really an idiotic thing to a couple of 22-year-olds to do. But we survived it. And we were very fortunate to survive it. And as a shameless plug for my brother's book, he wrote this book just before he passed away a couple of years ago that describes the trip in great detail, and probably more, a little bit TMI on my personal habits, but it is an interesting read. And I recommend reading it if you have a chance. So I wanted to say one thing about Labrador. You notice the term has come up a couple times already. In 1980, as if it weren't enough what we did to ourselves, we went back in 81, 82, and 83. And every time we did this, we would work in whatever jobs we could get in New Hampshire, usually factories or I was ski patrol and did a few other things like that. And we'd spend every cent we had doing these expeditions so that when we came back, we'd live in our tents by the Pemigewasset River until we could get another shitty job and then do the whole thing over again. And so at that point, I decided maybe I should go back and finish my undergraduate degree. So I went back, and that's what I did. And then and of course, at this point, I was taking classes that mattered to me. I learned about the physical environment by taking some geography classes and geology classes, and I thought, well, this is what I wanted to do. And so I managed to get myself marginally accepted into Arizona State University in '86, and that's where I met the first dendrochronologist I ever met. So when people ask me how I got into dendrochronology, it was really quite by accident. Dave Staley was doing his PhD when I was doing my master's, and we became good friends, and he's the one who taught me how to do dendrochronology because he said the project I was doing in Arizona on looking at climate and the sky islands, those mountaintops where the refugia of Engelmann spruce would end up on the tops of these peaks. I was interested in those, and he said, well, why don't you do a tree ring study on that? Which is what I did. And so I ended up working with Tom Swetnam at the tree ring lab. And by the time I got finished with my degree, Dave told me, there's this job opening at this place called the Lamont-Doherty Earth Observatory. And a guy named Gordon Jacoby, he's kind of a cantankerous sort, but he works with Ed Cook, who's the coolest SOB you'll ever. He didn't use SOB, he used a much worse word than that. But he said, you should go work there. And I'm like, why would I want to live in New York City? And I'm a country boy, I didn't want to do that. But then when I talked to Gordon on the phone, he said, oh, no, you should come check it out. And I met Gordon at Tucson. I drove down from Tempe, met him outside the tree ring lab in Tucson, which was in the football stadium at the time. It's now in its own building. But the tree ring lab then was in the side of the football stadium, and Gordon was giving a lecture. And he told me, drive to Tucson, I'll meet you, and I'll give you an interview. 15 minutes of talking and asking me only about Labrador. He wasn't interested in anything else. And he said, as he was going into his talk, he said, you're hired. And I said, okay. So I went out there, and then the thing was interesting. I started this job in 1989, the week of my 31st birthday. And within a month, I was in Labrador because Gordon had a project that he was working on with Jonathan Overpeck and Julie Cole and Dave Anderson from NOAA to compare these varve sediments in these mirromictic lakes with tree rings. And that's how I got involved in working here at Lamont, by that thing. And if anyone remembers Gordon, Gordon was a Marine. And when I met him, because when he was 19 years old, he had these big panthers tattooed on his arms. And he really was kind of a rough-looking guy. And I thought he didn't like me at all because he just didn't really like to talk very much. But we ended up working together for 3.5 years. And I have to say that when I just felt so blessed that in the life that I had led up to that point, and I was making $20,000 a year, which was really a lot of money to me in those days, to go all over the world. And in that 3.5 years, I got sent to all these places and probably others that off the top of my head, I was filling this in. But there was a couple of things that stand out in this time that I was there, aside from working on the San Andreas Fault and driving trucks full of wood samples across the country. And, really, I was away probably 7 months of the year. I'm going to highlight two things that really made a huge difference to me when I was working there. And the first one was Gordon's earthquake studies. He paid for me to go take the advanced research diving course at Scripps with a guy named Jim Stewart, who was a classic old diver at Scripps and had been involved in all this stuff. And we were looking at these, if you look at these yellow spots in Lake Washington, anyone been to Lake Washington, to Seattle? This is Mercer Island here. And you can see these yellow spots are areas where there were landslides of trees that had sunk to the bottom of the lake. And of course, this is actually not a picture of Lake Washington. If it was, you wouldn't be able to see the divers there because the visibility was so poor. But we went and sampled trees from the bottom of the lake, and there's a whole interesting story with that, which involves the FBI, the first time I ever had any interaction with the FBI. Because of the guy who was sampling trees with a barge and a cherry picker, we did it without permission. So Gordon and I had all of our film confiscated by the FBI. And of course, we were acting like jackasses in a lot of the films, so we decided to edit that part out, and they wanted to know why we edited it out, so we had to hand over all the film to them. But it resulted in this really interesting paper that we did on looking at the correlation between these landslides and an abrupt tectonic events that were expressed all around Puget Sound in the Seattle area. And the offshoot of this was about 1,000 years prior, there had been a significant earthquake in the Seattle area, and that the region was really prone to these sorts of events that happen, and when they happen, they're big. And it's interesting how life comes full circle, because just in the last couple of years, there's a new paper published by Brian Black from Tucson that followed up on this and extended it even more and just reinforced what we showed in this first paper. But I'm quite proud of this. This is one of the first major papers I was on and really put me onto my career. The other one was on my first year of working there. Ed went to Tasmania. And when he came back from Tasmania with a swag of samples, he borrowed me from Gordon. He bought my time for a month to work on the core samples that he had. And one of the things that we looked at was these high elevation human pine trees from Tasmania that were almost, in a way, the last thing I was going to look at, because they didn't look very good. But when I started looking at them under the microscope, the cross dating was phenomenal on them. And they had this really, really strong relationship to growing season temperature that we found out. And we published this paper, Climate Change in Tasmania Inferred from a 1,089-year tree ring record of Huon pine. And what I find interesting about this, if you remember from the early 1990s, global warming was not widely accepted. It really was something that was still at the time where people were debating it a lot. And we caught a lot of flack on this paper from people who are somewhat famous from the ClimateGate thing, a guy named John Daly from Launceston, who was claiming that a lot of what we're looking at was because we compared it against the climate records from 3 stations in eastern Tasmania, that it was a heat island effect, which was really ridiculous because that wasn't the case at all. But I wanted to point out one thing here that I found interesting, how cautious Ed was in describing what we see here. This growth increase and supports claims that a climate change, perhaps influenced by greenhouse gases, is in progress. Although this increase exceeds any that inferred or have occurred during the past 1,000 years, it's not clearly emerged from the natural background variability. It was a fairly lukewarm endorsement of the idea that this was anthropogenic climate change, and yet we got beat up quite a bit on it. I'm surprised. To show you the record, this was it right here. So this is going out to the like the late 1990s, and this was the recent warming trend that came out of one of the coolest periods of the last 1,000 years or so. But our record went back 900 years, and then these pictures of Ed and I up here on the top of Mount Reed shows what this site was like, and I find this really interesting. There had been a fire in the 60s that killed a whole bunch of these trees. And underneath the trees that we're standing on here, Ed and I realized that we were standing on the old forest, the trees that had died thousands of years ago and had decomposed and rotted away. And we started cutting them with a chainsaw. And within a couple of years, we pushed the record back from 1,000 years of living trees to 4,000 years by piecing together trees that had died prior. So it was really quite remarkable thing. And we managed to produce a whole slew of papers on this. I'm not going to go into them now, but they are very interesting if anyone's interested. What I did for my thesis was I went out, I managed to live in Tasmania for several years, and it was, again, the most magical time of life. We went out, and when Ed would come down every year, we'd go out and sample all these sites in the western part of Tasmania. And one of the things we came up with was this idea that there was a changing temperature response with elevation for Lagrostobus franklinii. And when you got to be about 1,000 meters, you started really strongly linking into the growing season temperature, the summer temperature. And when you were down below that, the temperature record really wasn't very strong. But even though the trees lived for thousands of years. And in fact, the oldest living Huon pine ever found was here in the Harmon River. And I just wanted to show you how the news comes back again. Just a couple weeks ago, there were major fires in Tasmania. And this is the Harmon River site that we got ourselves into. We choppered in once and hiked in another time. And the fire, just recently, like within February, burned. There were reports that this had burned out the old tree. But just as of a couple days ago, it turns out that the 3,000-year-old tree, which is this one right here, HAR09, it's still alive and kicking. So I was happy to hear that. But it does go to show how much this, the changing climate and the effects of fires and all this, it's real and it's absolutely happening there. And it's really scary to think that we might lose some of these resources that have, living there for 3,000 years, but they are very fire prone and they don't do well when they burn out, and you may lose them forever if that's the case. But what I really wanted to talk about here, as Dave alluded to in the introduction, was that I became best known for the work that I did in Southeast Asia. And so I want to talk a little bit about a couple of papers that came out of this. But first of all, I mean, I'm from New Hampshire, and you saw from what I did before, I love going to places that were cool and temperate. I loved alpine areas. I don't like being hot. I don't like being sweaty. The food is weird in Asia. All these things that really struck me when I first went. I was like, oh man, how could anyone stand this? But I did end up doing this work, and it happened really kind of by accident. First, Roseanne dragged me to Indonesia on this trip in 1991, and it turns out that I actually quite liked it there. In spite of all the other things I just described, it really became very interesting to start to see, wow, this is a little bit more of an interesting place than I would have thought. The vegetation was incredible. But I did get sick in the guts for a year on that trip there. So I still blame Roseanne for that to this day. In 1995, actually, I followed up on a paper that a sampling trip in 1992 that I took with Mike Barbetti. When I started my PhD, we went up to Thailand. And we traveled all across Thailand and cored 400 plus trees, every different, 100 different species. And I ended up publishing a paper at the early part of my work on the Tasmanian stuff. As a little aside, this is the first authored paper I had on the pine trees from Thailand. And so this progression of papers here, from Roseanne and Gordon working on the Berlanga record and updating it, with me going to Indonesia and helping her do this, to me working in Thailand, and Natsada Pumajamdang and I both published papers in the same journal, hers on teak, mine on pine. Suddenly we started to get this momentum going for work in Southeast Asia, and we realized this is actually going to work. And then over the course of time, when I came back from Tasmania and I started this job in 1999, we, in 2004, got this project funded here, a 5-year NSF grant. And what I'll say about this was really NSF taking a pretty bold stance on funding our lab at that time. It actually saved my bacon at that time, because it was getting really difficult to get funding, to keep ourselves going on that old DARS model, which meant if we had to raise 12 months of salary, there was no backstop for salary. These were times where it was pretty difficult to keep these things going. And so we got the entire lab funded for 5 years to the tune of $5.5 million, because all of us were working, Roseanne and Gordon and Ed and myself, were all working in various parts of Asia on things that were pretty connected to each other. So we got funded to do this, to go to Asia, to study the monsoon with the tree ring records. And this is the map as it stood in 2010. These are the sites that either we collected or colleagues of ours gave to us. And Ed did his statistical magic and produced out of this work the Monsoon Asian Drought Atlas, which turned out to be a really significant bit of work that came out of the Asian tropics. I'm only going to show one slide here on the drought atlases, but right now, as you can see, the very first one was the North American Drought Atlas, because there's so many records from North America that led to this. But the one I worked on with Ed is this Monsoon Asian Drought Atlas here, the MADA. And we were able to reconstruct all of the grid points on a gridded product by taking the climate data and extrapolating it to a gridded location, and then interpolating from the tree rings to those grid points. So you can actually go to any grid point across Asia and see how well we did at retrodicting the climate for that particular spot. And it enabled us to do some really interesting things, which is look at the spatial extent of droughts and what they look like across space and time. And that was really important. And getting back to now, my role in this was I filled in the Southeast Asian part of the record, which was really critical for getting at some of these areas that we had zero data from before. And it was a matter of picking up something that really wasn't no one really wanted to work on it, because it wasn't very pleasant to do. And it was really hard, but it turned out to be very interesting. And as you can see here, I've got pictures of wood that's all conifer wood. The angiosperms are a whole different set of problems working with them. So teak was the only broadleaf tree from this region that has actually produced anything in the way of really usable tree ring chronologies, and they're not that long. But it just so happened when you go to parts of Southeast Asia in the Annamite range, we had this conifer tree, a cypress, that went back more than 1,000 years. And they cross-dated really well. And the thing about cross-dating tropical woods are there's so many problems with what the climate's doing and how the rings form that it's very challenging sometimes to get the absolute dates assigned to the rings in sequence. And for example here, this is a sequence of cores from central Vietnam. And in one core sample, there was 51 rings missing on one side of a tree. The other side of the tree had only 7 rings missing. And we would learn this by matching up a lot of different samples from many different trees. And so it was a really tedious process. But once we did that, we had these incredible records. And one of the other things that confounded us too was this is a pine tree from Laos, are these false ring bands that form. And you can see a lot of them in here. They're in almost every single ring. Sometimes there's multiple ones, and they really confound us in being able to see what we're actually looking at. Sometimes these are induced by people gouging the side of the trees for or that resin that they collect for fire starting and so forth. But it posed some real challenges for us. But looking at conifers, I just wanted to point this out because this kind of surprised me. I was trying to pawn off the Vietnam work on someone else because I didn't want to do it. I thought it wouldn't work. And I'm glad I ended up with it at the end of the day because we hit the mother lode of species here. There are 36 species in 19 genera of conifer in the Annamite range from like northern Vietnam down through the south and then through Laos. And I've looked at almost all of them. And what we found is that a lot of these, the ones in yellow here, have annual rings that we can match. And the ones that have asterisks are ones I've created records from. But Phocaenia at the end of the day is the one that actually was the champion and really was quite the species. Clear growth rings, excellent cross-dating, a very strong climate response in spite of growing in a tropical forest where there would be hundreds of species growing together. And normally you'd have these confounding signals because of all the competition and all these other factors there. But that external imprint of climate on that species was so strong that they could match each other's, the pattern of rings, of the wide and narrow rings, or dense and less dense rings. And that's a real surprise because that was something we would not have predicted. And I'll show you a couple of cores here from probably the best tree that we had from the first site that we developed. This was a 750-year-old tree that had only one missing ring on it. And I could match every tree that I looked at against it and get the master signal very well replicated from that. This is just showing the location of where the Phocaenia samples are from. The blue dots here are the ones that were completed records from. And then we had plans for going into the central Annamite range and finishing up, but the pandemic then stopped us from following up on that work. This is something this year I went back and put this back in motion again to go back and get new samples to fill in the rest of this record. But these were some of the best replicated, best cross-dated, and longest records of tropical dendrochronology from Asia. There's a slew of papers that have come out of the Phocaenia work. The first one was this one by Masaki Sano and Tatsuo Sueda. They invited me to work on it with them because the one teak record that I built from northwest Thailand showed an 18th century drought that was really a significantly epic drought. And because it was in teak and I didn't have a lot of replication to it, I wasn't really sure what to make of whether I was really seeing this period of drought. But as it turns out, it shows up all across Asia. And it's now known as the Strange Parallels drought. It's a drought that was named after Victor Lieberman's book by that name that looked at the correlation between northern Eurasia and Southeast Asian polities and how they collapsed around the same time. And I want to focus on this paper here that came out after we did this with Masaki and looked at finding this 18th century mega drought that also now existed in 2 locations. We found it again in the southern part of Vietnam at this record here at Bidup Nui Ba. And I'm going to focus on this again because this was the longest record built from the region. And here's where my Mae Hong Son teak record is. Here's the Mukong Chai site from this paper. And here's where this one is located. And what we found was that during the time of the known demise of the Angkor Kingdom, there were two big epic droughts. Right here, Angkor droughts 1 and 2, that show up in the record, and in probably as important with that, in between this is a wet period. And this is where most of the damage to infrastructure is done at Angkor. It's quite an interesting story, and I'm not going to go into a lot of the details tonight, except to say what they got hit was, after centuries of having the infrastructure that they built for the Western Barai and all these water movement systems and water storage tanks to mitigate the effects of drought, and mainly to mitigate the effects of flooding, they were hit with two big droughts and tried to rejig those Barai, the drainage systems, so that they would allow more water to come into their tanks. And then what happened was it got really wet in the middle. It had these tropical storms that sat over this region and flooded it and cut through a lot of the walls of the city of Angkor Thom where the Mebon are, with all those statues of the faces. And they had this major damage from the infrastructure. And you could see the evidence in the archaeological record where they tried to undo what they had done, so they were trying to reverse the flow of water in both directions because of drought and because of flood. And that's where the damage came from. And if you look at the three records here, here's the strange parallels drought in the 18th century that shows up across, really from northern Vietnam down, all the way down to South Vietnam. We now know that this was a pretty epic period of drought. And the drought atlas shows us how this stood up. Here's the record looked at another way, and I just wanted to point out a couple of things here. So this is a reconstruction of the PDSI, the Palmer Drought Severity Index. And so below this line, these are negative departures, or these are drought. You can see what the numbers mean here of how extreme wet or dry it is. And then what we find here is that here's the Angkor droughts, and here's the wet periods in between. Here's the strange parallels drought. You can see how significant that was. What really stood out with this record was how strong the linkage was to El Nino and anything related to El Nino. We compared it against the Nino 3.4 box in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. We could actually reconstruct it with significance based on this record alone. We looked at the interdecadal Pacific Oscillation. It was very strongly linked into that. And then another thing that we noticed was the wettest years on record were the biggest volcanic dust veil eruptions, the Sandalas eruption and the Kauai eruption. And it turns out Kevin Achikaitis published a paper on this the next year that showed the linkage there, that the models weren't picking up this really big pulse of wet conditions right after we had these big events. And our records showed that very strongly. And the reason why we're so strongly linked into ENSO variability can be seen in this plot here. Here's where the beta site is located here in southern Vietnam. And all of this area here is from a paper by Dye and Wigleywood. They took the average of the rainfall anomalies from across the entire Pacific region and showed where there was wet or where was dry anomalies. And anywhere you see pink or red is a rainfall deficit because of the ENSO. And then this blue area here is where it's wetter than normal based on these ENSO events. And we are stuck right in the middle here in Vietnam, in the middle of the action of this western part of this big blob of anomaly here. And it makes it really highly sensitive to this. And also, this is a classic pattern that you see in the leading mode of variability across the entire globe of ENSO. Well, one thing that really stands out too is this seesaw between Southeast Asia and North America, Western North America. When one is dry, the other is wet. And this is a really strongly expressed signal that shows up really strongly from all the records we look at. There's a paper that Ed just published last year with Mark Kane, where he uses the tree ring records to reconstruct the Nino 3.4 box, the sea surface temperatures here. And you can see the sites that are used in this. And of course, these 5 Vietnam Phocenia records are really strongly linked into the ENSO variability that they were able to reconstruct. And that prior plot I just showed you is expressed a little more carefully here, where you can see there's seasonal variations of where the rainfall anomalies fall. So there's this really beautifully complex picture of how an ENSO expresses itself through space and time that can be really a good guide to see why the tree rings records are showing us what they show. And it's a good way to compare what we're doing. I'm going to highlight one last paper here that's based on that relationship I just showed you on the IPO, the Interdecadal Pacific Oscillation. And this is, we were able to do a reconstruction based on a number of records that we used of the IPO. So the yellow boxes here are showing you, this is where the first PC, the leading mode of the 5 records of Phokenia that I showed you on that prior map, that's the leading, the number 1 PC, the principal component of them. So it's the information that they share that's related to climate. And then box here shows the North American Drought Atlas grid points of drought that are linked into the strongest expression of the IPO. And we use these 2 patterns here to reconstruct this entire field of IPO, of the index of IPO, and it shows up so strongly in it that you can see this classic pattern that shows up here. This is the classic El Nino decadal expression, and we were able to produce this reconstruction here. So we knew that the IPO was significant, but this is the first time we had evidence of the fact that it was consistently expressed for the last 700 plus years, to the point where there's 15 positive phases of it that were pre the historical range and 15 negative phases. So this has been a consistent pattern that's been showing up across the Pacific and expressed in the tree rings, particularly from Vietnam and from the southwest of the US. And also what you can see here is that very many of these big droughts that we've been talking about, the 2 encore droughts, are among these periods. This is the Ming Dynasty drought. This is what we've named the unnamed drought. A good name for a drought, unnamed drought. Here's the Strange Parallels drought. And this is the East India drought that was expressed in Bangladesh in the latter part of the 18th century. And then these are Victorian Holocaust droughts in the late 1800s that led to a lot of famine and so forth, linked to big El Nino events. So this was a really cool result that we got from that. And I know I'm running a little bit long on time. I don't want to take up too much of your time because we have drinking to do after this. And I understand there's music at the 76 house we're going to go to. But I wanted to say a little something about where the future of all this lies, because Ed's not getting any younger. I mean, I am. I'm actually getting a little bit younger. But we need to leave this lab in some sort of condition we want to see the long future of tree rings at Lamont. It's such an important thing that we do. And I wanted to point out a couple things, not just the work that we do, not just the science, but the soft power for America. If we put ourselves out in the world and we work with people from all these different countries and we become really like family with them over the years. And I think that that's something that we overlook a lot of times of why we do what we do. It's not just about the science, it's about the whole package of things. We're out in the world and people know who we are and they see us regularly, and it improves their lives if they're connected to the stuff that we do. And I think everyone who works at Lamont feels that way when we're out in the world and we're doing things like this. So there's a lot of things here, like I highlighted a couple of here. Understanding the physical constraints on growth rings, because this is kind of what Mukund Palat Rao, one of our newest member of the Tree Ring Lab, just presented on the other day at the Lamont Sanctuary Forest, right over here. We've been instrumenting the forest now to make multiple measurements of carbon by species through time. The other thing here was multi-parameter streamflow reconstructions. These are a couple of things that we were high on doing, and then these educational research initiatives from things that we've been doing around the world, but also here through the sustainability science programs that we teach at Lamont. And so I wanted to just quickly summarize a really cool paper that my postdoc, Hung Nguyen, did when he was here. He's now at Illinois. But this is Hung comes from a background of water management. And one of the things about reconstructing streamflow from tree rings is that you typically end up with one value. It's like an annual streamflow. And we don't do a very good job at capturing high flow events because when we're using typically ring width. But we started using stable isotope analyses with a colleague of ours to get oxygen 18 ratios from the tree rings that we've worked on, and that enables us to look at the high flow events with much greater fidelity. And what Hung did was very cool, was use a mass balance adjustment to make sure that these individual monthly reconstructions of hydroclimate of stream flow, which mimicked a gauge, could be constrained to add up to the total of the annual again. So this actually is the first time we're headed in this direction of making reconstructions of stream flow that would actually be useful to water managers in a meaningful way. We're one step closer to operational usability of stream flow reconstruction for managers. And this is something that Hung is continuing to work on. And I'll point out the reason he's able to do this is because Ed and myself and Carrie and all the people in the tree ring lab have done this work of developing these records with our own sweat and joy, I would say, all around the world that enable us to take place. And so that was one of the things that I thought was very worth mentioning, and it's one of our own that's now gone out somewhere else. And then the other thing is our own Lamont Sanctuary Forest over here it was deeded to us by Mrs. Lamont for research and education purposes. And over the years, all of us have used it, maybe for one particular study or something. This is the first time we've systematically gone about actually instrumenting this forest and studying it in ways that give us insights into what's happening here. Because anyone who's lived here long enough knows that it used to be dominated by hemlock out there back in the 80s. It was, on the maps it says the Lamont Hemlock Forest. And those hemlock are almost completely gone now because of the woolly adelgid, but also the climate warming has made them, has impacted them. And you can still find some of them out there, and I've located them and taken core samples from them. We also have a lot of other really interesting things happening here, like this, which I find kind of disgusting, where all these lanternflies on ailanthus. And there's a lot of ailanthus trees that are way more in that forest than I would have expected, and they're older than I thought. And we've been putting instrumentation on them. And there's a lot of, I'm not going to go into the details now, but there's a lot of really interesting questions that could be asked of whether we eradicate them, or are they sequestering enough carbon to make them a useful species to have in there. These are philosophical questions that we grapple with. The young man I just showed you, and this is Martin Celadon. He's one of my students from the master's program. And one of the things Martin's working on here is a carbon map by species and by location in the first hectare that we put in. So when you walk on the trail behind Comer, if any of you hike back there and you've seen all those little pink flags on all the trees, and then you see the little boxes where we've got a little device measuring growth, that's what this is all about. And we're now measuring soil carbon fluxes and a bunch of other things as well. But this is a map just showing carbon concentration by species and by location across the site. And you can see there's a lot of variability here based on the hydroclimate where it's wet. There's some wet spots here where we have really big tulip poplars, and then a whole lot of sugar maple. These ACSA are all sugar maple. This is in its infancy. We started this last year. We're using it in our classes when we teach about forest and response. And actually, that's my last slide, so it's perfect timing. This is Ed and myself on the first trip, I believe, heading down under. It's probably like 4 o'clock in the morning as we're about to go get on the plane. And this is me hitchhiking home from Winnipeg in September 1977. And that's all I got for you. Yeah, sure.
We have a couple minutes if you have a question or two for Brendan, I think.
As an amateur, I'm totally unclear what, if any, damage you do permanently to trees if they're not removed. You mentioned core samples.
That's a great question.
Is that a harmful process to the tree or a safe technique?
It injures the tree, but when we think of trees, it's best not to think of them as, they're not like a physical body like we have. The only real living tissue is just right under, we breach the cambium, which is a few cells wide, and that's it's not exactly accurate, but it's probably safe to say that that's the only living part of the tissue that we're damaging. And all the rest of that is non-living but functioning tissue of the heartwood. It never replaces, it won't grow it back, right? So we put a hole in the tree, that hole will be there. But I want you to think of it this way. If you see a tree struck by lightning or losing a whole branch, that's a massive injury to the cambium, and they survive that. So we are injuring the tree, but we're not injuring it very much. It's probably the equivalent of us getting a mosquito bite or something. I'm saying this as a non-tree. Maybe they hate it. We don't really know. But that's a great question. We get that all the time. I will say this, that I've gone in the 1980s, I went back to core trees that Andrew Ellicott Douglas cored on the Front Range of Colorado. And we found his tags and everything. That was probably 50 years prior to that, I'm guessing, right? Yeah, so we go back to the same trees and we can core them again many, many years later. So it definitely doesn't kill the tree. What I will say is that trees that are really good at compartmentalizing a wound and walling it off chemically, they're the ones that live to be 1,000 years old or 3,000 years old. Trees that aren't good at doing that don't live very long. We tend not to core those trees. I think like beech, fagus, they tend not to be very long-living trees, so we don't necessarily have an interest in them. But it's a great question, though. Sometimes I kill trees for fun. But I digress.
Maybe one more.
Sure.
Sorry. Can you explain why trees are missing their rings?
Where is the question? Yes, I can. So when you look at a tree, in the canopy, when the foliage is activated at the beginning of the season, there is a hormone called auxin that is actually produced in the foliage, and it works its way down the stem and initiates the cambial cell division that you see. So the bigger the tree gets, the more distance that auxin has to cover, the more area that it has to cover. So there's a natural tendency as the diameter gets bigger for the ring to get narrower. The narrower that tree, even though it's the same volume of wood, it's spread over a much bigger area. And so if the auxin is not sufficient because it was a poor year, or the tree decided to allocate resource elsewhere, you can end up with bare spots. So it's not a completely missing ring. It's absent locally where we cord it. And usually if you poke around the tree in a number of places, you'll find that ring somewhere. And it's through the cross-stating process that we find it. But it's really related to resource allocation. Where does the tree want to put its resource? That's a great question, by the way. Yes?
Yeah, so what is the oldest tree that you've ever examined that was alive? And then you examined, what's the oldest tree that you've examined that maybe was dead, like at the bottom of the lake? Like I assume that those trees at the bottom of the lake, they were dead, but yeah.
So the oldest tree known in existence is probably still was the Prometheus tree, the one that was actually cut down by a grad student in the 60s. That was a 5,000-year-old tree, legit, lived that long. I don't know, I don't think anyone's ever found one older than that. Personally, the oldest tree I've ever sampled was the one I showed earlier, the Harmon River tree from Tasmania. That was 3,000 years old. We couldn't reach the center of it because it was too big. We didn't have cores long enough to get in that far. And that was a 3,000-year-old tree. And I've cored some, I took sections from trees that were radiocarbon dead from Tasmania also, that same species. It doesn't rot at all, so it sits there in the landscape, and we excavated it out of river sediments. And that was radiocarbon dead, meaning it was last interglacial, so probably 40,000 plus years old. So, and Ed has a great piece of cowrie in the lab that is 50,000 years old or something. Radiocarbon dead, yeah.
All right, thank you, everybody. Thank you, Brendan. I got some words. Yeah, thank you, Brendan. You sharing your time and your inspiring work and a few stories from the field. I'm happy you survived those early years, honestly. Good job. Thank you all for coming tonight. Your presence is especially meaningful for lots of reasons. Particularly, this is our 75th year anniversary for Lamont-Doherty, and it's the upcoming is the 50th year anniversary of the Tree Ring Laboratory here at Lamont, which you heard a lot about tonight. Your continued support and interest in our work make it possible. Your deep interest in science, of course, and your engagement in programs like this. So thank you all for coming. And as you may know, our work is funded in large part by federal support, federal grants. Some of that is at risk these days, and individual support can make all the difference in our ability to continue our science mission and navigate, as we are doing, this moment in time.